Hey, I'm Lee Wright, the founder of History Camp, and I am near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History. Tonight we have with us Ed O'Donnell, who is a professor, historian, and let me try that again, host of In the Past Lane podcast. Thank you for joining us, Ed.
Oh, it's great to be here. My pleasure.
So, Ed, you've also presented at History Camp multiple times, and we're greatly appreciative of those presentations. I know the folks were too, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Glad to do it.
I'm going to talk about the Gilded Age. Now, I want to also just let people know, at the end of the evening, we're also going to give you an update on America's Summer Road Trip on August 1, which has really been coming together. If you haven't seen it in the press, it's going to be in San Jose Mercury News, USA Today, so on and so forth. And you heard about it here first. Anyway, we'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so Ed, this in today's climate, when talking about maybe a Facebook, a Google, Amazon, and so forth, there's some talk about the Gilded Age, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of a return. Talk to us about what the Gilded Age was, when it took place, and kind of what were some of the major kind of defining characteristics of that time in American history.
All right. Well, the Gilded Age, it doesn't have unlike the Civil War or some other era where it's got a kind of a hard beginning and a hard end. It's roughly the last third of the 19th century. So if you Googled books on the Gilded Age, you'd see them, the subtitle would have 1870 to 1900. Some of them say 1865 to 1900. Some say 1877 to 1905. It's roughly that last third of the 19th century. And it's one of the most exciting, explosive, and tumultuous times in American history, where so much is happening. It's really, some people would say, it's the birth of modern America, where everything from technology to national expansion, mass immigration, all the kind of things, emergence of huge cities, all the stuff that we sort of think about when we think about the United States, becoming that world power and becoming that great nation state. That's really where you can see it happening.
Interesting. So, and do let me ask. I think we had the idea of the Gilded Age, gilded with gold or whatever.
Yeah.
Was that a term that was used at the time, or is that something that historians attached or journalists attached later?
Well, it's mostly later. So, I mean, the phrase comes from the era. Interestingly, it comes from a book co-authored by Mark Twain called The Gilded Age. And the book is, it's published in 1873, and it's got a lot of, people on the make, people on the take, scamming, con men, and so forth. And it kind of, that's really at the early stages of the Gilded Age, but it kind of anticipates the kind of era that's unfolding. So people probably used the term here and there, but it did not, you would not find it if you did a keyword search and say the, New York Times database. But it's a great term for historians. Historians love the term in many ways because it's a great metaphor. It's an age of gold. There's no question about it. It's unprecedented wealth creation, expansion of corporate America, the build new technology, really dazzling kinds of things like the Transcontinental Railroad, electricity, electrifying cities, devices like the phonograph, which we look at today and think how quaint, but they were just mind-blowing in their day. The telephone, and things like, and really in some ways the key sort of, what if you had to pick one thing, I always say steel. Steel changes everything from medical instruments to warfare to industrial technology to structures of buildings. Another wonder of the age is the skyscraper, which is emerging in this time period. So on the one hand, there's stupendous fortunes, aggregate growth of national wealth, and all this fun stuff. But at the same time, on the other hand, this is where the metaphor, if you have a bracelet made out of iron, but it's been dipped in gold, it looks really nice. But if you scratch the surface, you see this cold, hard, ugly iron. And that's what people in the Gilded Age were saying. They're saying, look, we see all this wealth and prosperity, and yet we not only have poverty, we seem to have more poverty, bigger slums, more people living on the edge of starvation, more people, going on strike, all kinds of social turmoil. So it's an age of optimism, and it's also an age of anxiety. And those are it's kind of the duality of the time, progress and poverty. Famous title of a famous book by Henry George, a great reformer from that time period. Really kind of, it's if ever there was a dualistic era in American history, this is it.
Fascinating. So let's talk about some of the major players, some of the major personalities. You mentioned George on the labor reform side, and then we also, of course, have the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and so forth. Do you want to take us through some of those, who some of those major players were?
Yeah, so I mean, if you looked at who are the most notable people, it is John D. Rockefeller. And he's pioneering in this new thing called the petroleum industry, and is one of the guys who comes out on top. And by 1880, he's consolidated and controls about 85-90% of America's oil refining, and so he's going to make a tremendous fortune and have incredible influence over American society. Along with him is Andrew Carnegie, and he's really in some ways the poster child of the Gilded Age. He's truly a rags to riches story. Kid from Scotland, goes to Pittsburgh and makes his way. It's great kind of rags to riches story, and then eventually gets into the steel industry and becomes the steel king. So Rockefeller's the oil king, Carnegie's the steel king, and there are J.P. Morgan becomes sort of the king of Wall Street and king of finance. And there are lots and lots of other people whose names wouldn't necessarily ring a bell today, but who were incredibly famous in their era, sort of pioneering in everything from railroads to meat packing to housing construction, you name it.
Interesting. And then what about on the political reform labor side?
Yeah, well, I already mentioned Henry George. He's a guy I've written a book about, so I will restrain myself and not talk too long about Henry George. But he's this fascinating guy who with only like a 6th grade education, but he's very smart, and he ends up he's in the newspaper business out on the West Coast, and he's really troubled by this fact that he's living in the age of wonders and gold and railroads and telegraphs and skyscrapers and big cities, but also just tremendous poverty and social unrest that goes with that. So he sits down in his spare time to write this book called Progress and Poverty, where he diagnoses all the social ills and the way, and says, if we don't stop it, we will have no republic. We will, if you have extreme inequality that gets more and more extreme, history tells us that's the end of any kind of representative democracy. And then he comes up with a solution called the single tax, which I won't, belabor you with, but he becomes one of those very influential figures in the Gilded Age. There are others like Mary Elizabeth Lease, who's from the Midwest, and she gets involved with another reform movement called the populist movement, and which is a revolt of farmers. So it's not just industrial workers who are revolting in many ways against this exploitive system. It's also rural people who are finding that even though they live out in Iowa or Nebraska, and they're far, far away from Wall Street, the big cities, they're in the grip of Wall Street because Wall Street is financing commodities and financing railroads, and they can't get loans for their crops except from banks. They have to move their crops on railroads. They can charge whatever they want. So it's an era of tremendous social unrest, and there are series of labor leaders, and also I should mention Terence Powderly. The Knights of Labor becomes the world's largest industrial union at the time, and he's the leader of that movement. So there are well-known people all across the social spectrum.
Interesting. Was some of the inequality or whatever the result of both the massive economic expansion, attracting then immigrants, and others from perhaps other parts of the country, more rural areas, going to the cities, going to where these opportunities are?
Yeah, I mean, it's a time of incredible population movement. So probably the most population movement internally in our history, certainly up to that time, of people moving from rural areas to cities and to get work in the industrial workforce. And then also just tens of millions of people, 35 million people from 1880 to 1925 or so coming to the US. So just huge numbers of people, and there are no rules. So there are no labor laws. So, you show up in Pittsburgh, and if the going rate is 16 cents an hour, or 16 cents a day, I should say, in some cases, that's what you have no recourse. You might maybe get lucky enough to get some skills and get into a union, but so the ability to exploit and to wring value out of workers is really unprecedented. And that's, as workers in the time period would say, they say, look, we are, our fathers fought in the Civil War and helped end chattel slavery. That's a glorious moment in our country. And yet here we are 20 years later in the 1880s, and we see a new kind of slavery being born, a wage slavery, where, people are working 60, 80, 90 hours a week and are unable to feed their family. That is those aren't free people. Those aren't citizens of a republic. They are Russian serfs for, in so many words. And if we don't do something about this, because they're not lazy, Somebody's gaming the system. Capitalism is good, most people would say. Some people were socialists, but most people were believers in the system, but they said somebody's twisted the system. Somebody's gaming the system and then using the advantage they gain to get even more. And so that's how they would diagnose it.
And if I remember right, there was no kind of constraints around immigration either. Is that right?
Right. Pretty much
Very
wide
hard.
open.
Yeah.
There are a few laws, but most of them are unenforced. And in 1882, the nation passes the Chinese Exclusion Act,
Right.
very explicitly racist in its origins. So there are some, but basically it's wide open. In the 1890s, Ellis Island is opened because along with immigration always comes intense nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. So America's American-born people are up in arms about this influx of foreigners and their foreign ideas and so forth, and all the same things we hear today, much of which is not true, but it's the paranoia. And also Ellis Island is open as this great screening center. And even then, only 2% of people, of the millions that pass through Ellis Island every year, only 2% were ever sent back. So it's about as wide open an immigration system as one can imagine.
That is fascinating. There is, as a quick side note, there's a photo exhibit that shows individuals coming from different countries, individuals who are wearing their finery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finest clothes from each of the countries or cultures. And it really underscores the vast diversity of individuals. That's fascinating. So we've got large population movements, large influx of individuals. We have the ability to build large industrial entities, driven in part by steel and petroleum and so forth. But there were not just perhaps the well-known industries, but I mean, it was really kind of across the board, isn't it, in terms of the types of industries that we saw flourish during this time?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you have quintessential ones like Carnegie's Steelworks, right? These vast plants that I think by 1890, he has 25,000 employees in his main, series of connected factories. So, I mean, just unthinkable 30, 40, 50 years ago. But if you look at New York City's economy, it's the biggest economy in the country. It's almost, there are no giant steelworks there. It's thousands and thousands of small garment shops, cigar making factories, jewelry factories, just small, what economists would say, value-added enterprises, kind of high-end goods that are going to be distributed across the country. So it's more production, more technology, allowing for more production, but then also the distribution system. So we have a national economy where people are making goods in Boston and then selling them all across the country. Not coincidentally, it's the birth of advertising. So how do you find out about something like Ivory soap if you live in South Carolina? Well, you see it in a magazine and it tells you how great it is. And so the evolution of brands and brand loyalty and marketing, that's all born in this time period.
Fascinating. And I don't know the dates, but I assume this is also a time when we saw the expansion of entities such as Sears Roebuck and their catalog.
Yeah, Sears catalog, I think the origin is in the 1880s. So
Okay.
their insight is, hey, there's this booming consumer economy, but there's millions of Americans who are unconnected to it because they live in rural areas. How about we come up with this, the mail order catalog? And the original Sears catalog was a single page with print on both sides. But it caught on because there are people in rural America who are bored and they like reading material. They want, maybe some jewelry, and before long they could order anything. I mean, my favorite part about the Sears catalog is, this is more in the 20th century, is that you could order a house.
Yes.
You'd buy a house, and the whole house would show up in parts. And if you think putting an IKEA bunk bed set together is a challenge, I imagine the Sears house presented challenges as well.
So during this period, we have the rapid industrialization, and then we also have some very high profile and in some cases very tragic labor management conflicts and so forth. Do you want to talk a little bit about where those were in kind of the timeline and the development of industry as we go from, let's take your dates of roughly 1865 to 1900. And at what point was there law or regulation that codified some things and perhaps created more stability?
Yeah, so even just the idea of striking was controversial. and it was illegal for all intents and purposes to go on strike. So one thing is that striking did occur. There are strikes that take place in the late 18th century and early 19th century, but they're pretty rare, and they're usually among skilled workers, people that have a little bit of leverage, skilled shoemakers and that sort of thing. But in the Gilded Age, just the last 20 years of the 19th century, so 1880 to 1900, there were 37,000 strikes. And I've never gotten around to adding it up, but I'll bet you there's not more than, say, 3,000 strikes in all of American history up to 1880. And yet in the next 20 years, 1,000 strikes, big and small. So some of them are, massive national railroad strikes that result in federal troops coming in to crush them, 100 workers being killed, big, and millions of dollars of property destroyed. So some of these are pretty spectacular events. The Pullman strike in the 1890s plays out similarly, a national railroad strike. There are some strikes that are fairly small, but they become quite famous. Andrew Carnegie made this kind of reputation for himself of being the good industrialist who treated his workers well, who wrote glowing articles about the gospel of wealth and how the system is fair to everybody, and he was also a very genial looking guy. If you Google Andrew Carnegie pictures, he's the most photographed industrialist of that era. But when push comes to shove, he's not a benevolent grandfather. He's a hard-nosed capitalist, and so in 1892 he wants to get rid of the union in his steelworks and locks out the union, and a big strike ensues, and it makes national headlines because it is a very violent strike. But it also it calls into question this kind of image that Carnegie had said, yeah, there are a few bad actors, but most capitalists are good, and capitalism is mostly a beneficial system. So a lot of these strikes ended up gathering a lot of attention. There are other labor moments. Another one is 1886 in Chicago. There's the 8-hour movement. I talk about no rules. There's no rule on what the workday is. So there's a big national movement to get the 8-hour day established. And the long and the short of it, in May 4th, 1886, workers are gathered in Chicago for a labor rally. It's organized by anarchists, but it's a very peaceful, orderly, pretty, vehement rally, but it's a pretty orderly one. And the Chicago police come in to break it up. And to this day, it's not quite sure what happened, but a bomb was thrown into the ranks of the police, killing at the end of the day, a lot of police were killed by friendly fire, but 7 policemen were killed. So you can imagine, anarchist rally ends in 7 policemen killed. It is screaming Red Scare headlines all across the country. I always tell students, America's had many Red Scares. McCarthy's was really the third one. It's the post-World War I is the number 2, and the number 1 is the 1880s Red Scare triggered by the Haymarket bombing in Chicago.
Interesting. And so you mentioned the 8-hour workday, and I think that was 8 hours, 6 days a week, right?
Yeah, it would have been 6 days. Some places had what they called the half holiday, so you would work 8 hours a day, or whatever it was, 10 hours a day. But then Saturday you might get off at, say, 1 o'clock. That was a common kind of negotiated point that some places had, but other places, just like we see today, if you look at meat, poultry, slaughterhouses and things today, that is, they're not looking for career workers. They want to work you really hard, pay you the least amount possible, subject you to dangerous conditions, and they know you're going to leave. But they also know that there's 5 people waiting and to take your place. The same story that comes out in The Jungle by Upton Sinclair in this time period.
Sure. Is that when was that published?
It comes a little bit later. It's 1906.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and let's talk then about some of the responses to this. So we have the rapid industrialization, we have the immigration, the movement, the population movement in, it sounds like many cases, both large and small, labor action. Play that forward. We also, at a certain point, are going to start talking about trusts, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, what they're reacting to are these trusts. And I mentioned some of the biggest strikes were railroad strikes. Well, railroads are the largest corporations in the world, American railroads. They also are, national corporations. They're lines, physically, they stretch across the country. So they really are a unique entity. And in order to kind of manage these enterprises and to finance them, business people turn to what they call a trust, basically using investors and stock and creating, instead of a single person owning a company, it's owned by multiple investors. And that creates it. There's financial reasons why you want to do that, but it also kind of creates this thing other than the people running the company, right? So if you sue the company, you actually, or sue the, your boss, you're actually not suing your boss, you're suing this sort of fiction called the trust or the corporation. People use those terms in some ways interchangeably. And one reason why people didn't like trusts was that for that very reason. They seemed sort of soulless, huge, powerful entities that could corrupt politics, which they did. There again, no rules on financial contributions and all, but they also understood that these trusts became bigger and bigger and bigger. So I mentioned earlier, John D. Rockefeller, he's really the inventor, or at least certainly the popularizer of the trust. He starts out with a very small oil refining operation in Ohio, and he just continues to buy all of his competitors. He does sneaky things to make them go bankrupt, and then buys them at a fire sale. He conspires with railroads to charge his competitors way more to move their oil so that they suffer, and then he can take over. So there's this kind of by 1880s, he controls most of the oil refining in the country. That's both scary in the sense that he might be able to set any kind of price he wants, but it's also scary. And this is the part that people forget today when people talk about, like, why is it a big deal that who cares if Google is huge, right? The thing is that with bigness, it's not merely a matter of price. That is always a concern, lack of competition, but it's also that these people are so tremendously powerful and can use their power to influence politics and to get legislation passed and things like that. If Andrew Carnegie telegraphs the president, he's going to get a telegraph back. If one of his workers does, he's not going to get a telegraph. It might, wouldn't even be delivered.
Sure. I do recall John D. Rockefeller asking the question of if kerosene now is 1/10 the price of when I started, kind of what's all the commotion about?
Right.
Yeah. So we have the rise of trusts, and then also we have a response called antitrust. And I think to think of Teddy Roosevelt being kind of at the forefront of that. Help us with the timing here. When does that start to? When does kind of the tide start to turn, perhaps, and there be this broad awareness and concern in legislative and executive branch action?
Well, antitrust activity really starts in the 1870s, at the very beginning of the Gilded Age, and it's mostly in rural areas. So the first kind of corporate control, corporate regulation efforts are in places like Iowa and Nebraska, and it's the early version of the populist movement called the Grangers, and they pass a whole series of laws saying this is the maximum rates that the railroads can charge to move, agricultural products. This is the maximum, and open pricing and all kinds of things to kind of rein in the power of these, what they saw as exploitive, unchecked corporations. And that idea, in fact, anti-monopoly is the historical term. Andrew Jackson was pushing anti-monopoly or anti-monopolism back in the 1830s, saying we can't let corporations get too big, we can't let banks get too big. That's why he tries to kill the Bank of the United States. So the idea that a monopoly or any kind of powerful, unchecked entities out there, that's sets off the alarm bells in the Republican, small r, Republican mind. And so by the 1880s, when you have not just big railroads, but big steel companies and all these other combinations, antitrust rhetoric and initiatives really get going. And the first successful one is the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And this is a good point to point out that it's not just exploited workers who are complaining about exploitation and the dangers posed by large corporations. It's wealthy people, it's middle class people who are alarmed by the potential for the abuse by these corporations. All the great cartoons of showing big businessmen, bloated money sacks. There's a great one people should look up called The Bosses of the Senate, and it shows little senators in the foreground, and behind them are these huge, menacing money bag shaped trusts. That comes out of Puck magazine or Judge magazine. These are the two big ones. And those are not read by workers. Those are read by lawyers and doctors and teachers and middle-class people. So there's clearly widespread anxiety up and down the social scale about what all this means. And so by 1890, Congress responds. It's a very tepid law. By the time it becomes law, the Sherman Antitrust Act has, most of the teeth have been kind of knocked out of it. But it's a beginning, and it'll also still be on the books. And when Roosevelt becomes president in the early 20th century, he'll use it in a way, it's, as they say, there are two parts about law. One is the law, and the other is the way in which it is enforced or not enforced. And so it does lay the groundwork for a more vigorous antitrust movement.
Fascinating. I actually think I've seen that cartoon. We should link to it in the description here. There's another one I recall, and this just surprised me. I think of railroads, steel. I think of petroleum. But here was one that listed, I think, the sugar trust, the paper bag trust, and so forth. And it can seemingly no end to that.
Right. I mean, I think that's the point behind that is that everything is subject to consolidation. So, who would think the paper bag trust, but, saying that if this trend goes unchecked, it will be everything right down to things like pencils and paper bags.
So let me ask you a question that some of us here in New England we probably visited, and I'm sure folks across the country, the Newport mansions. And
yes.
I think that's one of the things that people think about in the Gilded Age, in some of the cases those being with the gilded furniture and lighting and so forth. So those were summer cottages, only lived in for a matter of a few weeks in the summer, as I recall.
Yeah.
When were those built in the time period relative to the Gilded Age?
Well, most of them are built in the 1880s and 1890s. And they are, just as you say, they're these stupendous, they call them cottages because, as to sort of emphasize, it's really nothing, it's 75 rooms, and, a dining room that could seat 300 people, they're just gaudy. And this is, not surprisingly, the phrase that people are familiar with, I'm sure, conspicuous consumption. That's coined by a sociologist in the 1890s, sort of looking around at this. And what he was getting at is that it was a new phenomenon. And that, if you go back in time to say the 1830s, it was understood that rich people didn't act rich. You didn't get a coach and liveried servants and build a gaudy mansion because that was very un-Republican. That was the kind of world that we had left in 1776. So if you were rich, you could build a very nice house, and the example I always use is, Fifth Avenue is sort of a good example of where, the Vanderbilts and the Morgans, they'll build these stupendous Gilded Age mansions. But if you go downtown to Gramercy Park, that was the center of, wealthy America back in the 1830s. And much of it's still preserved. And you look around, you're like, these are just simple brick-faced, they're nice. And they clearly had nice paneling and beautiful inlaid floors on the inside, but they were incredibly modest looking mansions for the richest people in the United States. And because it was just considered unacceptable to flaunt one's wealth. But by the 1870s, it's a whole new world. People are saying, if you got it, show it. If you got it, flaunt it. And this is so, we not only have the mansions, but we have these gaudy, displays of consumption, these balls and soirees. The most famous one is the Vanderbilt Ball in 1883. People should Google it. You'll see that not only it cost millions of dollars to open this palatial mansion, that the interior looks like, the photographs look like they're from Versailles in France. But it was also the people dressed up, obviously it is a costume ball, and people dressed up not just in funny costumes. Most of the guests dressed up as European royalty, which every founding father would have just fainted and said, "You're done, you're cooked, it's over," because it was just really just unthinkable that we would ape the un-Republican world that we had broken away from. And the example I always use with students is that in the 20th century, if you're old enough to remember, the 20th century Americans were very sure that they were democratic and believers in capitalism, and they were not communists. Like everything was sort of subjected is that communist, or is that communist leaning, or are we trending towards communism or socialism? In the 19th century, it was, are we trending towards Europeanism? This, and not ethnically, but socially. Are we becoming a nation of haves and have-nots? Is somehow an American aristocracy emerging among us and acting in those ways, building mansions, passing on wealth to their children, taking titles? That's a whole nother thing. You can look up dollar princesses. Something like 300 American women marry European royalty from the 1890s, in the Gilded Age into the early 20th century, because Americans had the cash, and all these Brits had the estates and the titles, but no cash. And so Winston Churchill is half American because his father was a wealthy British aristocrat with a huge estate and all the great lineage and power, but they were broke. So they, the family brokered kind of a free agent signing, married a nouveau riche young woman named Jenny Jerome. Her dad was a zillionaire Wall Street guy, but who had come from nothing. And so Gilded Age cash allows you to both sides win. The impoverished European royalty get an infusion of cash, and the Americans get the titles. And and if you were a fan of Downton Abbey, that's Cora is that woman. She's the daughter of the Pittsburgh industrialist who saves temporarily the Downton, I can't remember, the Crawley family by marrying the guy who has the estate and the lineage and all of that.
Yeah, fascinating. So, Ed, this has been very interesting. Again, people can refer casually to the Gilded Age. I think now a much better understanding of what it was, some of the factors, and I think Carrie has some questions to ask that we've received.
Yeah. So, how does progressivism emerge during the Gilded Age?
Yeah. So, if you take a typical U.S. history textbook, there's the Gilded Age chapter, and then the next chapter is progressivism. Sort of 1870 to 1900 is this tumultuous period we've been talking about, and then 1900 to 1920 roughly is this great period of reform. It's understandable why people think that way. You have to sometimes simplify things, but it is true that there's a lot of questioning and hand wringing in the late 19th century, and there are tremendous suite of reforms that come out of the early 20th century to address some of these problems. So. And we call it the progressive era. But there are, like I mentioned, Henry George. Henry George is one of the first progressives, and he publishes his famous manifesto in 1879. The populists are progressives, and basically what they're to boil it down just a couple of points. The key elements of progressivism are saying, the founding fathers never could have anticipated this situation, right? They all grew up in a rural environment. They could never envisioned a corporation, or B, the richest man in the world, be John D. Rockefeller, who's completely beyond the reach of any kind of democratic restraint. So that's one thing. And then also the great inequalities that are emerging. And people like Henry George saying, if you have extreme inequality, your democracy is going to die, and there's no going back. It's like you go over a cliff, you can't get back. And then, so what do we do? That's the big question. What do we do? And so early in the 19th century, or in the founding period, the fear was that they feared power, and they said power is situated in the government. So the government needs to remain small and powerless and decentralized. 100 years later, Americans still fear power, but now they see that the government is not the biggest power in the land; it's these corporations. And so there's this interesting turn in our Republican political culture, saying we need a bigger government, a stronger government as an intermediary, kind of like a referee, to restrain the power of these great unelected, unreachable entities, these corporations and these industrial titans. So you still fear power, but now the power is not in the government. The government is actually going to be the instrument by which we tap down. We don't nationalize the industries. We're not socialists, but we're going to restrain that power in the name of this other point, which is crucial, which is a kind of a reviving of the idea of the common good. Americans sometimes think that we are a nation of individualists and we prize individualism and all. We do. All the founders prized individualism, but they also prized the common good, the things that connect us. And the idea of, say, Jefferson was a big proponent of public education, right? He said, we got to educate everybody, or the greatest number of people. It's going to cost money, but it's going to make us a better country, of a greater country of opportunity, a more stable country. And so this idea of doing things in the name of the common good. So if you look at the progressive era, one of the big problems are these big cities that are so dirty and so pestilential, and tuberculosis and all the other ills are running rampant. And over time, people realize that public health is vital, and that we need to come up with everything from new sewer systems to street cleaning regimens to public health inspectors. We have to give them power. We have to regulate businesses that produce a lot of this pollution. We need to mandate plumbing in housing, no more outhouses. And by the early 20th century, that becomes a norm, that there's a thing, in the name of public health, we need to do these things. It's going to cost more, and you might give up your liberty to pollute, but so what? You're going to, the rest of the society is going to benefit. And that, and we've always, those two things have been in tension. And that's another kind of connecting point that we see to the current moment, where we sort of look back and see there's been a long run of individualism being the supreme idea in the land. And what you're seeing now with Occupy Wall Street and all the other movements that have been taking place, broadly speaking, is a resurgence of the idea of the common good, and that we need to do things that are going to benefit the greatest number of people. So I think that's how the Gilded Age becomes the Progressive Era, and also how we can see a connection between our period now and that period back then.
Okay, great. Perry would like to know what caused the change in attitude about displaying your wealth if you had it. Did the experience of the Civil War play a part in that?
I don't think it's a little bit later. It's more like about a decade later, the 1870s, that it starts to happen. And it's a question it's hard to know. One of the things is that as Americans get super wealthy, they go to Europe and they begin to travel to Europe and they begin to sort of revere this kind of idea of the high life of Europeans. Not coincidentally, what do wealthy people also do? They start digging into their genealogy. American genealogy is born in the Gilded Age. All the genealogical societies, historical societies, many of them are founded, but particularly genealogy, because if you got the cash but you don't have the lineage, maybe if you hire somebody, or you can get somebody to dig into your past and figure out you are actually the 13th cousin of Louis XIV or what have you. So there's this kind of growing fascination and desire for legitimization among nouveau riche Americans to burnish their credentials. And it's also a time of just, unprecedented commercialism and consumerism. So I think all of those things kind of coming together change the rules. I mean, we can see, like we talk about the sexual revolution in the 60s. Like when did that start? And what were the things that made it happen? It's not entirely sure what made that happen in the 60s, but we know it happened. And that's the same kind of thing of the conspicuous consumption revolution happens in kind of the same way.
Okay, interesting. Fran would like to know, when did income taxes come into play with the extreme rich?
Yeah, so there was a temporary income tax during the Civil War, and that was really just to finance the Union war costs. It was very quickly retired after the war. There were many attempts to bring it back because what reformers and others were saying is, look, people used to make their money through commerce, selling and buying and selling goods and shipping and farming and so forth. People are now making their money in unique ways. And so Andrew Carnegie in 1890 makes $25 million, no taxes, none. So they're saying this new kind of wealth needs to somehow be taxed. And all, in this case, taxed for two reasons. One is to kind of take a little chip off the wealth of the wealthy to lessen their power, but also to kick into the coffers for the public good, for the things that need to make the government run. So there's a long push for it. And eventually in the early 20th century, the income tax is adopted and becomes, through a constitutional amendment. And even then, it's really aimed at the very high end of earners and aimed at corporations. But over time, it is broadened to include more, a much larger chunk of the population. But it was incredibly controversial. And if you read, conservative media in these days, there are many people who will say that the income tax is completely unconstitutional. Kind of hard to argue that since the income tax is now in the Constitution. But anyway, be that as it may.
All right, wonderful. Okay, I'm going to veer off topic just a little bit here. Mm-hmm. So many of you may know, or you may not, Ed has been a speaker at History Camp Boston before, and I wanted to kind of get your perspective about History Camp. Will you just kind of tell people your experience with History Camp?
Well, I had heard about History Camp quite a few years before I joined it. And it's in Boston, at least. I mean, now there are several, but the one that I know is the one in Boston. And if I'm not mistaken, it was a Saturday. And I pitched a couple of ideas. I think the first time I did it, I did two speaking things. One is, as I mentioned earlier, I have a podcast. I'm also a teacher, professor. So my podcasting isn't completely a sideline thing. It's really my students now make podcasting episodes. So it's a part of my teaching repertoire as well. So I think I was on a panel about, professors who podcast or teachers who podcast. And that was fun because it was a multiple participant panel. And then later I did another thing that I do because of my working on US history textbooks was using images to teach history, which is why I love those Gilded Age cartoons like everybody else. So I did a whole thing on how to use, I've got a visual learning scheme that I came up with that I introduced people to and sort of talked about multiple ways in which you could use images to teach history. So I had a lot of fun, and it's a big swath. It's history buffs, it's genealogists, a ton of, teachers, scholars, people that are, say amateur scholars, they've got, they're insurance salesmen, but they've been, they probably know more about pirates on the East Coast of Massachusetts in the 17th century than almost anybody else. And so they gave, more like more lecture talks. So it's a really fascinating thing. It's a lot of fun, there's a lot of positive energy, lots of collaboration as well. I don't think it, I've been to those other history conferences where it's a lot of great people, a lot of friends, but geez, a lot of ego and a lot of posturing and such. So it's fun. I guess I would say it's a very democratic, very decentralized thing. So I would highly recommend it for anybody who has the opportunity to go, because it's and if you're interested in history, or if you're a teacher, or just want to see what do people do, beyond, if people are into history, what do you do besides be a professor or be a researcher? Like, what are the ways in which people are pursuing that passion? I think it's a great example of, you'd be exposed to a lot of fun people, a lot of fun ideas.
Thank you. That is fabulous. And we love having you come to History Camp. And it's really fun to get all the different presenters from all those different backgrounds together, as well as all the people who are just there to immerse. Yeah.
It also has a great T-shirt every year. So,
there you go.
You got to get that. Got to get your name in, your registration in, because you might get shut out of the great T-shirt.
So true. All right, one more question just came in, so I'm gonna pop back to the Gilded Age. Donna said her students read The Jungle when they're studying the Gilded Age, and she wanted to know if you have other suggestions for high schoolers that they should be reading.
That's a good question. So for the Gilded Age in that time period, I would say, I'm a big believer in some cases in excerpts. Even The Jungle gets a little long after a certain point, for young audiences. So I believe, like Henry George, his book in 1879, Progress and Poverty, is a little heavy going, but a lot of it's very easy to read. And where he, a couple of, in fact, if Donna sends me an email, I can send a couple of excerpts, but where they can kind of get the gist of what he's saying about the problem of inequality in a democracy. Jacob Riis is also quite fascinating. His book How the Other Half Lives is published in 1890, and what's great about that, as a guy who teaches images, is that it comes with, he's famous for what he says about the problems of urban housing and the inhumanity of urban housing, and people living in slums and tenements. But he does the revolutionary thing of bringing this huge camera along and taking these famous photos. There's certain aspects of Jacob Riis that are a little unsavory, like, is it cool that he took his camera into people's homes and probably just barged in and took photos of them, eating dinner and all? But it's a really fascinating book with a fascinating history behind it. So those are two that I would think of. Florence Kelley is another great reformer in the time period, and her focus was on child labor. As was Lewis Hine. So Lewis Hine, Hine, he is like Riis. He's sort of the next generation of Riis. He takes his camera and photographs child labor. And people have been talking about child labor for decades as a problem, but until there's photos, people didn't really sit up and take notice. And when you see, if you just Google a photo, Lewis Hine breaker boys, and these 11-year-old, 10-year-old boys covered in soot, who have come out of the mines, obviously not in school, obviously inhaling all this, particle, particulate, not a bright future for them. So those I would say are a couple of, Maggie Girl of the Streets is another good short book about kind of the perils of urban life. Those are some that come to mind right off the top of the bat.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. We are about out of time, so we want to thank you for joining us tonight and for this great discussion. And just a couple of reminders for everyone. We, of course, want to remind you about America's Summer Road Trip, which is coming up in just over a week. That'll be August 1st. It's a Saturday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. We're visiting 12 different historic sites. You'll get a behind the scenes look. So even if you've been to some of those sites, you will see something that you haven't seen before because it's not on display for the public. So check that out at americasummerroadtrip.org. And that's also where you'll go to watch all those tours on Saturday. Now, next week for History Camp Online, we will have Ben Myers with us speaking about the Civil War and the experiences and writings of Captain George Brooks from the 46th Pennsylvania Infantry Volunteer Group. All right, so tune in then. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Ed. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you. My pleasure. A lot of fun.